Why German Generals Called Patton. The Mad Bulldog of the West. The tank exploded 30 feet from where General George Patton stood. Metal screamed through the air. Fire erupted from the turret in a column of black smoke that clawed toward the gray French sky. Shrapnel peppered the ground around his boots. Officers dove for cover. Soldiers scattered like leaves in a hurricane. Patton didn't move. He stood there, pearl-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips, watching the burning Sherman with cold blue eyes that seemed to calculate something the rest of his Third Army couldn't comprehend. The smell of cordite and burning flesh hung in the August heat. His jaw worked slowly, grinding down on fury that lesser men would have screamed into the world. "Get that crew out," he said. Not shouted, said. This was Normandy in the summer of 1944, and the breakout from the hedgerows had just begun. For 2 months, Allied forces had been bleeding themselves white against German positions that turned every field and stone wall into a fortress. The bocage country of northern France was a defender's paradise and an attacker's nightmare. Machine gun nests, mortars, 88mm guns that could punch through Allied armor like paper. But Patton had arrived with a different kind of war in mind. He studied the burning tank for 3 more seconds, then turned to the colonel beside him. "How many roads lead to Avranches?" The colonel blinked. They were still under fire. German artillery was finding their range. Another explosion cratered the field 200 yards east. "Sir, we should—" "How many roads?" 3 main routes, General, but they're all mined, defended, zeroed by artillery. I know." Patton's voice carried that strange Texas drawl softened by years of Virginia Military Institute and cavalry commands. "That's why we're taking all 3 at once. Tonight." The colonel's face went pale. "Tonight? Sir, we haven't cleared—" "Tonight," Patton repeated. "Because right now, 20 miles from here, Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge is sitting in his command post thinking he knows what we're going to do. He thinks we'll consolidate, regroup, wait for supplies. He thinks we fight like the British." He didn't say it with contempt for the British. Just fact. Cold arithmetic of war. "But we don't fight like anyone they've ever seen." Patton had spent 3 years preparing for this moment. 3 years in disgrace after slapping 2 soldiers in Sicily, watching from the sidelines while other generals got the glory. 3 years of being called a loose cannon, a prima donna, a man too dangerous for modern command. The newspapers had crucified him. Eisenhower had nearly sent him home. But the Germans feared him. Wehrmacht intelligence had tracked his movements obsessively. They'd intercepted radio traffic, monitored his Phantom Army group in England before D-Day. German generals stayed awake at night, trying to predict where Patton would strike next, because they knew something the Allied High Command was only beginning to understand. George Patton didn't fight wars. He fought nightmares. His Third Army had become operational just weeks ago, and already the reports filtering back to German headquarters painted a picture that defied military logic. American columns moving at speeds that shouldn't be possible. Armor appearing in places they couldn't have reached. Entire German divisions waking up to find themselves surrounded by forces that weren't supposed to exist yet. Von Kluge had been the first to use the phrase that would echo through Wehrmacht communications for the next year. Der verrückte Bulldog des Westens. The Mad Bulldog of the West. It wasn't a compliment. It was a warning. Patton walked past the burning tank without another glance. His boots hit the dirt road in steady rhythm, and behind him, officers scrambled to keep up. He was 60 years old, but moved like a man possessed by something younger and infinitely more violent. His face was weathered leather, stretched over iron conviction. His eyes never stopped moving, never stopped calculating angles and distances and the invisible geometry of battle that separated brilliant commanders from merely competent ones. "Get me 8th Corps on the radio," he told his aide. "I want every tank we have rolling south by 2100 hours. I want the 4th Armored Division on point. I want reconnaissance elements pushing so far ahead they're eating breakfast in German mess halls." "Sir, fuel supplies are—" "Fuel supplies are not my problem. Fuel supplies are for people who plan to fight this war next month. I plan to end it by Christmas." It sounded insane. Probably was insane. The Third Army was consuming gasoline at rates that made logistics officers weep into their clipboards. Patton's units were outrunning their supply lines so badly that some divisions were down to less than a day's worth of ammunition. His tanks were breaking down faster than mechanics could repair them, but they were winning. Every day, German prisoners flooded the rear areas in numbers that overwhelmed the processing centers. Every night, Wehrmacht commanders called Berlin with updates that bordered on panic. The American Third Army wasn't advancing. It was erupting, metastasizing across France like some kind of military cancer that ignored all the rules about flanks and supply lines and proper defensive positions. And Patton intended to make it worse. He reached his command vehicle, a specially modified half-track bristling with radio antennas. Maps covered every surface inside, marked with grease pencil in his own hand. Red arrows showed German positions. Blue arrows showed his divisions. But the arrows weren't defensive positions or careful advances. They were thrusts, penetrations, slashes across the map that looked less like military maneuvers and more like knife wounds. "Avranches falls tomorrow," Patton said to the officers crowding into the half-track. "The day after that, we're in Brittany. By the end of August, we're crossing the Seine." Someone coughed. Another officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir," a major ventured, that's over 200 miles in 3 weeks." Patton smiled. It was not a pleasant expression. 223 miles, he corrected. "I measured." The German Major General couldn't believe the reports crossing his desk. Heinrich von Luttwitz commanded the 2nd Panzer Division, one of the Wehrmacht's elite armored formations. He'd fought in Poland, France, and 3 years on the Russian front. He knew how wars moved. He understood the rhythm of advance and consolidation, the careful ballet of logistics and firepower that governed mechanized warfare. This wasn't that. "They're where?" he asked his intelligence officer. 30 kilometers south of Avranches, Herr General. As of 0600 hours. Von Luttwitz looked at the map. Yesterday, American forces had been probing the outskirts of Avranches. Yesterday, his division had been preparing defensive positions to block the main roads south. Yesterday, the war made sense. "That's impossible. We hold the bridges. We mind the crossroads. There are only 3 viable routes through that terrain." "They took all 3 routes simultaneously," the intelligence officer said. His voice carried the flat affect of a man reporting something he didn't quite believe himself. "And they didn't stop. They attacked through the night. Their armor columns maintained movement even without infantry support. Some units bypassed our strong points entirely and kept driving south. Von Lüttwitz felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd heard the stories about Patton from other commanders. Wild tales that sounded like propaganda designed to frighten children. An American general who led from the front lines, who appeared at random positions along his attack corridors just to scream at units moving too slowly, who planned operations on intuition and executed them with a ferocity that violated every principle of methodical warfare. "Get me von Kluge's headquarters," von Lüttwitz said quietly. But Field Marshal Günther von Kluge already knew. 40 miles to the east, in a commandeered French chateau, von Kluge stood over maps that told a story his military experience said couldn't be true. The American Third Army had punched through the Avranches Gap and was now flooding into open country like water through a broken dam. Multiple divisions, hundreds of tanks, thousands of vehicles, all moving at speeds that defied everything von Kluge understood about armored operations. How is he supplying them? Von Kluge asked his chief of staff. "We don't think he is, Herr Feldmarschall. Not properly. Our intelligence suggests American units are operating on minimal fuel and ammunition reserves. Some are reportedly scavenging gasoline from captured German depots." Von Kluge's hand tightened on the edge of the map table. "Then they'll have to stop. They'll run out of fuel and stall. We can counterattack once they're immobilized." But even as he said it, he didn't believe it. Von Kluge had commanded armies on the Eastern Front. He'd fought the Soviets through 2 brutal winters. He understood desperate attacks and reckless advances. But this was different. The Soviets attacked with overwhelming numbers, human waves that absorbed casualties and ground forward through sheer mass. Patton attacked with speed. Pure, incomprehensible speed that created chaos faster than German commanders could respond to it. By the time Wehrmacht headquarters identified where American spearheads had penetrated, those spearheads were already 20 miles deeper into France. By the time defensive positions were organized, Patton's armor was flowing around them like mercury around obstacles. "He's not fighting a battle," von Kluge said slowly. "He's orchestrating a collapse." The chief of staff nodded. "The men are calling him the Mad Bulldog. They say he doesn't think like a normal general." "He doesn't think like a general at all," von Kluge corrected. "He thinks like a cavalryman, like a raider, like someone who learned warfare from Jeb Stuart and Nathan Bedford Forrest instead of at Staff College." It was true. Patton's entire military philosophy came from 19th century cavalry doctrine translated into 20th century mechanized warfare. Strike hard, strike fast. Don't stop for anything. Keep the enemy reeling and confused until they break completely. The Germans called it Bewegungskrieg, war of movement. They'd invented it, perfected it during the invasions of Poland and France. Blitzkrieg, lightning war. Now it was being used against them. And Patton was better at it than they were. Back at Third Army headquarters, Patton stood in front of a wall-sized map of France and drew lines with his grease pencil. Not careful tactical boundaries. Sweeping arcs that cut across entire provinces. His staff watched in silence, trying to comprehend the scale of what he was planning. "The 4th Armored continues south," Patton said, tapping the map hard enough to leave marks. "They take Rennes. They keep going. I want them in Nantes by week's end." "General," his logistics officer interrupted carefully, "Nantes is 80 miles from Rennes. We don't have the fuel to—" "Then find it, capture it, buy it from French farmers. I don't care. Patton turned, and his eyes had that look that made junior officers check their bootlaces. Do you know what von Klug is doing right now? He's looking at his maps and thinking we're going to stop, that we have to stop, that no army in history has ever sustained this tempo of operations. He pointed the grease pencil at his logistics officer like a weapon, which is exactly why we're not going to stop. The officer swallowed. Yes, sir. The 6th Armored Division takes Brest. The 8th Infantry Division clears the western approaches. 15th Corps pivots east and starts driving toward Paris. Patton's pencil danced across the map, creating objectives that most armies would need months to accomplish. He was talking about days. I want maximum pressure on every axis. I want the Germans to wake up every morning not knowing where we are or where we're going next. His chief of staff, a colonel who'd served with Patton for 2 years, cleared his throat. Sir, intelligence reports suggest von Klug is planning a counterattack. He's pulling panzer divisions from the British sector. They'll try to cut us off at Mortain. Patton smiled. That terrible smile that meant someone was about to have a very bad day. Good. Let him counterattack. Let him commit his armor to a single axis while we're exploding in 6 different directions. By the time his panzers reach Mortain, we'll be so far south and east that cutting us off would require him to rebuild the entire Western Front. He turned back to the map, studying the roads and rivers and terrain with eyes that saw not geography, but opportunity. Every gap in German defenses, every vulnerable flank, every moment of confusion or hesitation that could be exploited. Speed, Patton said quietly. That's the secret. Speed is armor. Speed is surprise. Speed is the weapon nobody else knows how to use properly. He'd written about this years ago, before the war. Articles in military journals about mechanized warfare that most officers had dismissed as the ravings of an eccentric cavalryman. Patton had argued that tanks weren't mobile pillboxes or infantry support weapons. They were the modern equivalent of light cavalry. Shock troops designed to penetrate, exploit, and create panic in enemy rear areas. Everyone had nodded politely and ignored him. Until now. Now, German generals were scrambling to respond to tactics they'd never encountered from American forces. The British fought methodically, with careful preparation and overwhelming firepower. The Americans were supposed to fight the same way, just with more resources and less finesse. But Patton's Third Army fought like demons wearing American uniforms. His divisions moved at night. They attacked at dawn. They bypassed strong points that would have stopped other units for days. German commanders would establish defensive lines, only to discover American tanks already operating 30 miles behind those lines, cutting supply routes and creating chaos. Von Kluge's counterattack at Mortain came 3 days later. 7th German Army, 4 panzer divisions, the best armor still available to the Wehrmacht in France. Von Kluge threw everything he had at the American lines, trying to cut through to Avranches and sever Patton's supply corridor. It was a brilliant plan, aggressive, bold, exactly the kind of decisive action that had won Germany its early victories. It also failed completely. The panzers hit American positions at Mortain before dawn on August 7th. 200 German tanks, Panthers and Mark their Fools, with crews that had survived years of combat on the Eastern Front. They came out of the morning fog like steel ghosts, engines roaring, guns already firing. The initial assault smashed into the American 30th Infantry Division with devastating force. For 6 hours, it looked like von Kluge's gamble might work. German armor penetrated 4 miles into American lines. Entire companies were overrun. The tactical situation deteriorated so rapidly that some staff officers at Omar Bradley's headquarters began discussing evacuation of forward positions. Radio traffic crackled with urgent calls for reinforcements, for air support, for anything that could stop the German tide. Patton heard about the attack while inspecting a fuel depot 60 miles south. His aide found him personally counting gasoline drums, making sure his logistics officers weren't hiding supplies. The aide's face was pale, and he carried a radio message that trembled slightly in his hand. General, Mortain is under heavy attack. German armor and strength. 7 Corps requests immediate. No, Patton said. The aide blinked. Sir? No reinforcements. No redeployment. Patton went back to counting fuel drums. The 30th Infantry can hold. Tell them I said to dig in and bleed the bastards white. But General, if the Germans break through to Avranches... Patton straightened, and the look on his face could have frozen artillery shells in mid-flight. The Germans aren't breaking through to Avranches. Von Kluge just made the stupidest decision of his military career. He took his mobile reserve, his only striking force, and committed it to a single axis of attack against prepared American positions. He pointed south, toward where his armored divisions were still racing deeper into France. While he's banging his head against Mortain, the 4th Armored is taking Le Mans. The 6th Armored is approaching Nantes. 15th Corps is already crossing the Mayenne River. By the time von Kluge realizes his counterattack failed, we'll have his entire 7th Army surrounded. The aide's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You knew he was going to attack Mortain. I was counting on it, Patton corrected. Von Kluge is a good general. Excellent, actually. Which means he thinks like a good general. He saw my supply corridor as a vulnerability, a weakness to exploit. It never occurred to him that I wanted him to attack it. This was the thing about Patton that drove both his superiors and his enemies to distraction. He didn't just think 3 moves ahead. He thought in entirely different dimensions than everyone else at the table. While other generals worried about flanks and supply lines and proper military procedure, Patton was orchestrating chaos, like a conductor leading a symphony of violence. The 30th Infantry Division held at Mortain. Barely. They paid for every yard in blood and burned out tank destroyers. American soldiers fought from foxholes and ruined buildings while German armor rolled past them, trying to find the breakthrough that would justify von Kluge's gamble. But the breakthrough never came. American artillery, pre-positioned because Patton had predicted exactly where the Germans would attack, turned Mortain into a killing ground. Fighter bombers from the 9th Air Force appeared overhead despite the morning fog, guided in by ground controllers who'd been given specific coordinates days in advance. The German panzers ground forward into a meat grinder that destroyed them by companies and battalions. By noon, von Kluge knew he'd failed. By evening, he understood just how catastrophic that failure would be, because while the German counterattack was collapsing at Mortain, Patton's 15th Corps had already driven east and then north in a sweeping arc that was closing like a noose around the entire German 7th Army. The 4th Armored Division reached Le Mans and immediately pivoted north toward Argentan. The 2nd French Armored Division, operating under Patton's command, raced toward Alençon. The Germans suddenly realized they weren't fighting a battle anymore. They were caught in a pocket. Von Kluge stood in his command post, staring at maps that showed American units moving with impossible speed to positions that would seal the entire German force inside a shrinking perimeter. The Canadians and British were pushing south from Caen. Patton's forces were driving north from Le Mans. In between, 7 German divisions and the remnants of 2 Panzer Corps found themselves trapped in a pocket near the town of Falaise. "Pull them out," von Kluge said quietly. His chief of staff looked stricken. "Herr Feldmarschall, if we withdraw now—" "If we don't withdraw now, we lose the entire 7th Army. Every division, every tank, every gun." Von Kluge's voice carried the weight of a man watching his worst nightmare unfold in real time. "Patton has us in a pocket. He's been maneuvering us into this pocket for 3 weeks, and we never saw it coming." The withdrawal order went out that night, but it was already too late. Patton's units were moving too fast, closing the gap too quickly. German forces trying to escape the Falaise pocket found American armor blocking every road, every bridge, every possible escape route. The slaughter began on August 13th and continued for a week. Allied fighter bombers owned the sky. They came in waves, bombing and strafing the packed German columns, trying to flee through the narrow Falaise gap. Artillery from American, British, Canadian, and French units pounded the pocket from every direction. The roads became graveyards of destroyed vehicles and dead horses and bodies that lay in the August sun until the smell became unbearable. Patton drove to the edge of the pocket to see it himself. He stood on a hillside overlooking what had been the German withdrawal route. The carnage stretched for miles. Thousands of vehicles burned and twisted. Artillery pieces abandoned. Wagons full of equipment left by soldiers who'd fled on foot. The remains of an entire army scattered across the Norman countryside like the wreckage of some apocalyptic disaster. An officer beside him looked physically ill. Patton's face showed nothing. No satisfaction. No horror. Just cold evaluation of the mathematical results of strategic planning. "Could be worse," he said finally. The officer turned to stare at him. "Sir?" "Some of them escaped. Maybe 20,000 made it through the gap before we closed it." Patton pulled out his grease pencil and a folded map. "Won't matter. We're already past them. The 4th Armored crossed the Seine 3 days ago. By the time these survivors reorganize, we'll be in Germany." He wasn't exaggerating. While the Falaise pocket was still being reduced, Patton's lead elements were already racing east. The 4th Armored Division covered 70 miles in 2 days. They captured bridges over the Seine before German engineers could demolish them. They established bridgeheads on the far bank, while Wehrmacht commanders were still trying to figure out how American tanks had gotten that far east in the first place. The pursuit became legendary. French civilians lined the roads, throwing flowers at American tanks that were moving too fast to stop. Entire German garrisons woke up to find themselves surrounded by units that had been 100 miles away the previous day. Supply officers performed miracles, just keeping fuel and ammunition moving forward to divisions that were consuming resources at catastrophic rates. And Patton pushed harder. He flew in his personal L-5 observation plane from division to division, landing on roads and in fields to personally scream at commanders who weren't moving fast enough. He relieved officers who stopped to consolidate positions. He promoted sergeants to company command if they showed the aggression he demanded. "There's no such thing as too far forward," he told the 4th Armored Division commander. "There's only not far enough. I want you in Metz by September. I don't care how you get there. I don't care what you have to do. Just get there." The division commander, a major general who'd fought in North Africa and Sicily, nodded slowly. He'd learned not to argue with Patton. You either delivered the impossible, or you found yourself commanding a supply depot in England. "We'll need fuel," the general said. "You'll get it. We'll need ammunition. You'll get it. We'll need parts for maintenance. We're down to 60% operational tanks." Patton leaned in close. His voice dropped to something quiet and absolutely terrifying. "You'll get everything you need, but you will not stop. You will not slow down. You will not give the Germans one single hour to rest or reorganize or remember how to fight. You will drive them until they break completely. Understood?" "Yes, sir." Patton climbed back into his plane and took off, already heading to the next division that needed his personal brand of motivation. Behind him, across hundreds of miles of liberated France, the Third Army continued its rampage east. They moved so fast that maps couldn't keep up with their positions. They advanced so aggressively that German commanders stopped trying to establish defensive lines and simply retreated as quickly as possible, hoping to reach the German border before Patton's tanks caught them. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler received reports of the debacle in France with mounting fury. He ordered counterattacks. He demanded his generals hold every meter of French soil. He screamed about betrayal and cowardice and the weakness of his commanders. None of it mattered. The Wehrmacht in France was broken, not defeated in a single dramatic battle, not destroyed by overwhelming firepower, just broken by speed and confusion, and an American general who fought like a force of nature rather than a human being. Von Kluge knew it was over. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge sat alone in his staff car on August 18th. The vehicle was parked on a quiet French road, far from any fighting. His driver waited outside, giving the field marshal privacy for what everyone knew would be his final act. Von Kluge had been relieved of command. Hitler blamed him for the catastrophe in France. The summons to Berlin meant only one thing. He took the cyanide capsule at 1300 hours. Before he died, von Kluge wrote a letter to Hitler. In it, he described what had happened in France with the clarity of a man who no longer feared consequences. He wrote about Patton, about the Mad Bulldog, who had orchestrated not just a military defeat, but the complete disintegration of German defensive capabilities in the West. "The American Third Army moves like nothing we have encountered," von Kluge wrote in his careful script. "Their general does not fight to win territory. He fights to destroy our capacity to resist. Every day his forces advance, they create chaos that spreads faster than we can respond. His methods defy doctrine, but they achieve results that doctrine cannot explain." The letter was found beside von Kluge's body by SS investigators who brought it to Berlin. Hitler read it once and threw it in a fire. But the German generals who survived the war would remember von Kluge's assessment. They would spend decades analyzing Patton's campaigns, trying to understand how one man with limited resources had accomplished what should have been impossible. Military historians would write thousands of pages about the Third Army's advance across France, and they would all struggle with the same fundamental question. How did Patton move so fast? The answer wasn't logistics, though his logistics officers performed miracles. It wasn't superior equipment, though American tanks and trucks were reliable. It wasn't even numerical superiority, though the Third Army was large. The answer was something more fundamental, something that couldn't be taught at staff colleges or learned from textbooks. Patton understood that modern mechanized warfare was essentially a form of controlled violence happening at industrial speeds. Whoever could sustain higher speeds for longer periods would win. Not through any single dramatic victory, but through cumulative exhaustion of the enemy's ability to respond. He'd proven it across France in the summer of 1944. By September 1st, the Third Army had advanced over 400 miles from its starting positions. They'd liberated dozens of French cities. They'd destroyed or captured the equivalent of 20 German divisions. They'd reached the Moselle River and were preparing to assault the fortress city of Metz. Then the fuel ran out. Not gradually, not with warnings, just stopped. Allied logistics had finally hit the wall that everyone except Patton had predicted weeks earlier. The supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles. Every gallon of gasoline had to be trucked forward from Normandy beaches where it was still being offloaded from ships. The famous Red Ball Express, a dedicated convoy system of trucks running supplies 24 hours a day, couldn't keep pace with Patton's consumption. His tanks sat motionless near Metz, their fuel tanks empty. Patton stood in his headquarters and actually screamed, not at his staff, at the universe, at the cruel mathematics of logistics that had finally caught up with his tactical genius. Officers in adjacent rooms heard furniture being thrown, maps being torn. The concentrated fury of a man who could see victory just beyond his reach, but couldn't grasp it. We could be in Germany right now, he shouted at anyone within earshot. Right now. The Germans are beaten. They're running. They have nothing between here and the Rhine except remnants and stragglers. Give me fuel for 3 days. Just 3 days. I'll be in Berlin by Christmas. But there was no fuel. Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower had made a strategic decision. The fuel would go to British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery for a thrust through Holland toward the Ruhr industrial region. Patton's Third Army would have to wait. This moment, this sudden stop after months of relentless advance, broke something in Patton. Not his spirit, not his determination, but his relationship with reality shifted in ways that would only become clear later. He became obsessed with reincarnation. It started with offhand comments to his staff about having fought in previous wars, about remembering ancient battles, about being present at conflicts throughout history. At first, officers thought it was metaphor. Patton had always been eccentric. He wore custom uniforms with polished cavalry boots and those pearl-handled revolvers. He quoted classical literature and believed in aggressive warfare with an almost religious fervor. But the reincarnation talk got weirder. I was at the Battle of Crécy, Patton told a bemused colonel one evening. I was a French knight. I remember the English longbowmen cutting us down. I remember dying there. He spoke about it with complete conviction, about fighting with Alexander the Great, about being a Roman legionnaire, about cavalry charges across battlefields separated by thousands of years. His staff learned to just nod and change the subject. What they didn't understand was that Patton's belief in reincarnation wasn't madness. It was coping mechanism. He'd spent his entire life preparing for war. He'd studied military history with obsessive devotion. He'd internalized the campaigns of Hannibal and Caesar and Napoleon until they lived in his mind as vividly as his own memories. And now, having executed one of history's most brilliant campaigns, he was being told to stop, to wait, to watch the war continue without him while politicians and cautious generals made decisions based on factors that had nothing to do with destroying the enemy. The Third Army sat immobile for 2 weeks. During that time, the Germans rebuilt. They pulled shattered divisions back across the Rhine. They established new defensive lines. They reorganized their command structure and brought in reinforcements from the interior of Germany. Every day that Patton's tanks sat empty, the Wehrmacht gained strength. When fuel finally arrived in sufficient quantities, the war had changed. The rapid pursuit across France was over. Now came grinding battles against prepared defenses. The fortress city of Metz took 3 months to capture, not 3 days. The fighting in Lorraine through autumn became a bloody slog through mud and rain and German positions that had been given time to properly fortify. Patton's units still advanced. They still fought with the aggression he demanded. But the mathematics had shifted. Without speed, without the ability to create chaos faster than the enemy could respond, the Third Army became just another effective American force. Better than most, more aggressive than any, but no longer the unstoppable instrument of destruction that had terrified German generals in August. The Mad Bulldog was muzzled, but not permanently. In December, Hitler launched his last great offensive in the West. 3 German armies smashed into American positions in the Ardennes forest, creating the crisis that would be known as the Battle of the Bulge. The attack came through a supposedly quiet sector. It caught Allied forces completely by surprise. Within days, German panzers had created a massive salient in American lines, threatening to break through to Antwerp and split the Allied armies in 2. Eisenhower called an emergency meeting of his senior commanders on December 19th. The situation was desperate. German forces were still advancing. American units were surrounded at Bastogne. The weather prevented air support. Some commanders suggested pulling back to more defensible lines. Others talked about the time needed to bring reinforcements forward and organize a proper counterattack. Then Eisenhower turned to Patton. "George, I want you to take the Third Army north and hit the German flank. How long will you need to disengage from your current operations, reorient 90 degrees, and attack?" Every other general at the meeting knew the answer: reorienting an entire army, moving divisions that were actively engaged in combat, shifting supply lines, coordinating with new adjacent units, planning a major offensive. That kind of operation took weeks, maybe a month if everything went perfectly. Patton looked at Eisenhower and smiled. 48 hours. The room went silent. The other generals thought Patton was lying, or insane, or both. One of them actually laughed, a nervous sound that died quickly when nobody else joined in. The tactical challenge wasn't just difficult, it was theoretically impossible. The Third Army had 3 full corps engaged in active combat along a 100-mile front in eastern France. Patton was suggesting he could disengage those forces, turn them 90 degrees north, move them through winter weather on icy roads, and launch a coordinated attack into the flank of the German offensive. In 2 days. George, Eisenhower said carefully, I'm serious. So am I. Patton pulled out a folded map from his jacket. It was already marked with routes and objectives. I've had my staff working on contingency plans for a week. I knew the Germans would try something in the Ardennes. They had to. It's their last chance to disrupt our advance before we cross the Rhine. This was pure Patton. While other commanders reacted to crises, he anticipated them. While others scrambled to respond, he'd already planned 3 moves ahead. The map he spread on the table showed precise routes for 3 different corps, all converging on the southern shoulder of the German penetration. 3rd Corps will attack with 3 divisions on December 22nd, Patton said, pointing to his marks on the map. They'll hit the German flank here, near Arlon. Fiend. Corps follows 24 hours later, driving for Bastogne. XX Corps maintains pressure in the east to prevent the Germans from shifting reserves. A British general leaned forward. You're talking about moving 250,000 men in the middle of winter. 253,000, Patton corrected, plus tanks, artillery, and support vehicles. Approximately 133,000 vehicles total. They'll move on 3 primary routes with staggered departure times to prevent congestion. I've already alerted my division commanders. They're preparing movement orders now. Eisenhower studied the map. He'd known Patton for decades, knew the man was brilliant and aggressive and completely unpredictable. But this seemed beyond even Patton's capabilities. If you fail, Eisenhower said quietly, if you can't deliver this attack on schedule, the Germans might break through to the Meuse. They could split our entire front. I won't fail. There was no bravado in Patton's voice, no theatrical confidence, just flat certainty. He'd spent 4 years preparing for moments exactly like this. Moments when speed and aggression could change the course of entire campaigns. The Third Army would move because he'd built it to move. Because every officer in his command knew that Patton's impossible demands were actually just difficult demands that required extraordinary effort. Do it, Eisenhower said. Patton stood, gathered his map, and walked out of the meeting. He was in his vehicle and moving within 5 minutes. Behind him, other generals were still discussing the implications of the German offensive. Patton was already executing the counterattack. The Third Army began moving that night. In freezing darkness, entire divisions disengaged from their positions in eastern France. They left skeleton forces to hold the line and pulled their main combat units back to assembly areas. Engineers cleared ice from roads. Military police established traffic control points. Supply units began the complex choreography of moving fuel and ammunition north to support an offensive that hadn't officially started yet. It was organized chaos on an epic scale. Columns of vehicles stretched for miles, headlights off to avoid German aircraft, drivers navigating icy roads in pitch darkness. Tanks threw tracks on frozen ground and had to be abandoned. Trucks slid off roads and had to be pushed back onto the highway by soldiers who were already exhausted from weeks of combat, but they moved. By the morning of December 21st, lead elements of the Third Army were already in Belgium. By that evening, they were deploying into attack positions. German intelligence officers monitoring American radio traffic couldn't believe what they were hearing. Reports of Third Army units appearing in sectors where they'd been fighting 100 miles south just days earlier. The German Offensive Command dismissed the reports as impossible. Then Patton attacked. December 22nd, 0600 hours. 3 American divisions smashed into the southern flank of the German penetration with coordinated fury. Artillery barrages, tank assaults, infantry advances across frozen fields. The Germans, who'd been focused on driving west toward the Meuse, suddenly found themselves fighting for their lives on a flank they'd thought was secure. The attack wasn't elegant. It was brutal, grinding combat through winter weather that grounded aircraft and turned roads into ice rinks. But it was relentless. Patton had moved his army in 48 hours exactly as promised. Now, he drove them forward with the same intensity he'd shown in France. "Keep attacking," he radioed his division commanders. "Don't stop. Don't consolidate. Just keep attacking. The Germans are off balance. We hit them until they break." The 4th Armored Division drove toward Bastogne, where the 101st Airborne Division was surrounded and running low on ammunition. German forces tried to block the advance. They established roadblocks. They positioned anti-tank guns. They threw in their remaining reserves. The 4th Armored went through them like a bulldozer through cardboard. On December 26th, lead tanks from the 4th Armored broke through to Bastogne. The siege was lifted. The surrounded American paratroopers, who'd held the town against overwhelming odds, suddenly had relief forces arriving with fuel and ammunition and reinforcements. And Patton wasn't done. While other commanders would have consolidated, would have secured Bastogne, and prepared for the next phase, Patton kept attacking. His divisions pushed north into the base of the German salient. They cut supply lines. They encircled German units that had overextended during the initial offensive. They created the same kind of chaos that Patton had orchestrated in France, turning the hunters into the hunted. The German offensive collapsed, not through any single dramatic defeat, but through cumulative exhaustion. The same weapon Patton had used in France. The Wehrmacht couldn't sustain the pace of fighting. They couldn't respond fast enough to American attacks coming from multiple directions. They couldn't replace losses or reorganize defenses before the next attack hit. By mid-January, the Battle of the Bulge was over. The German armies retreated back across their original start lines, leaving behind thousands of destroyed vehicles and tens of thousands of casualties. Hitler's last gamble in the West had failed, and the German generals knew exactly who had beaten them. After the war, when American intelligence officers interviewed captured Wehrmacht commanders, the same name kept appearing in their assessments of the Western Front, not Eisenhower, who'd commanded the overall Allied effort, not Montgomery, who'd led the British and Canadian armies, not Bradley, who commanded the American Army group that included the Third Army. Patton. General der Panzertruppen, Fritz Bayerlein, who'd fought against Patton in France and the Ardennes, put it simply: Patton was the most dangerous general the Americans had. He understood that modern war is about tempo. Whoever can operate faster wins. We'd built the Wehrmacht around that principle. Then the Americans sent us someone who understood it better than we did. General Heinz Guderian, the architect of German Blitzkrieg doctrine, was more blunt. Patton fought the way we taught our generals to fight. He just did it better. But the most telling assessment came from German intelligence files captured after the war. Wehrmacht intelligence had maintained detailed files on Allied commanders throughout the conflict. The file on Patton was 3 times larger than any other American generals. It contained intercepts, aerial photographs, analysis of his tactics, even psychological profiles attempting to predict his behavior. On the cover of the file, someone had written in German, Der verrückte Bulldog des Westens, äußerst gefährlich. The Mad Bulldog of the West, extremely dangerous. The Third Army crossed the Rhine in March 1945. They drove deep into Germany against collapsing resistance. They liberated concentration camps. They captured hundreds of miles of territory. They moved so fast that German civilians would wake up to find American tanks already in their towns before Wehrmacht units could organize any defense. Patton wanted to keep going, all the way to Berlin, all the way into Czechoslovakia, maybe further. The war in Europe was nearly over, but Patton was already thinking about the next war, the one with the Soviets, who were advancing from the east and claiming everything in their path. We're going to have to fight them eventually, Patton told anyone who would listen. Better to do it now, while our army is already mobilized. But there would be no war with the Soviets. Not then. The politicians had already divided Europe at conferences in Tehran and Yalta. The borders were drawn. The Third Army stopped at the designated lines and waited for the war to officially end. Germany surrendered on May 8th. Patton stood in Bavaria, surrounded by the Third Army he'd commanded for less than 2 years, and felt something close to despair. He'd spent his entire life preparing for war. He'd studied every great commander in history. He'd internalized their lessons and created his own doctrine of speed and aggression. He'd proven those theories in combat from Normandy to the Rhine. Now it was over. The accident happened on December 9th, 1945, a routine drive on a quiet road near Mannheim, Germany. Patton was riding in his command car with his chief of staff, discussing hunting plans. They were going to hunt pheasant. After everything he'd done, after orchestrating the liberation of Western Europe, General George S. Patton was planning to shoot birds in the German countryside. The truck appeared from a side road without warning. It was a 2.5-ton Army vehicle making a left turn. The driver didn't see Patton's Cadillac approaching. The vehicles collided at low speed, barely 25 miles per hour. The impact was minor. The Cadillac wasn't even badly damaged. The other passengers walked away with bruises. Patton's head had jerked forward violently, then back. His neck hit the edge of the rear seat support. He slumped forward, conscious but unable to move. "I'm paralyzed," he said quietly. Those 3 words marked the end of the most aggressive field commander in American military history. The man who'd driven the Third Army across Europe at speeds that defied military doctrine. The general who'd terrified German field marshals and frustrated his own superiors with his relentless demands for action. The Mad Bulldog who'd changed modern warfare through sheer force of personality and tactical brilliance. Paralyzed by a traffic accident, they carried Patton to a hospital in Heidelberg. Doctors examined him and delivered the verdict he already knew. His neck was broken at the 3rd and 4th vertebrae. He couldn't move his arms or legs, couldn't dress himself, couldn't walk. A 60-year-old warrior reduced to complete helplessness by the kind of mundane accident that happened to thousands of people every day. But Patton's mind was untouched. He lay in that hospital bed, unable to move, and talked about his campaigns with perfect clarity. He discussed tactics with visiting officers. He read reports. He made plans for the military career He seemed to believe he would somehow continue despite the catastrophic injury. "I'll beat this," he told his wife Beatrice. "I've beaten worse." He hadn't. Nobody beat a broken neck in 1945. The medical technology didn't exist. The treatments were primitive. The prognosis was simple. Permanent paralysis if he survived at all. Infection was almost certain. Death was likely. Patton lasted 12 days. He developed an embolism on December 20th, a blood clot that traveled to his lungs. He died the next morning at 1750 hours, with Beatrice beside him. His last words were about soldiers, about the Third Army, about the men he'd driven across Europe with demands they thought were impossible until they accomplished them. The funeral was held in Luxembourg, among the American soldiers who died fighting under his command. They buried George Patton in the American cemetery at Ham, alongside men from the Third Army who'd fallen during the Battle of the Bulge. Not in a place of honor at the head of the graves, just among them. Another soldier in a field of white crosses, exactly where he'd wanted to be. The German generals heard about his death. Some of them were in Allied prison camps, awaiting war crimes trials. Others were in displaced persons camps, stripped of rank and authority. A few were already working with American intelligence, providing information about Soviet capabilities in exchange for lenient treatment. When they learned that Patton had died from a car accident, many of them refused to believe it. "The Mad Bulldog doesn't die in a traffic accident," one former Panzer commander reportedly said. "That's not how warriors like that die. They die in battle, or not at all." But he had died, the most aggressive field commander in American history, killed by a mundane collision on a quiet German road. It seemed like cosmic irony. Patton had survived decades of military service. He'd led cavalry charges against Mexican revolutionaries. He'd commanded tanks in World War I. He'd fought across North Africa, Sicily, France, and Germany. He'd been shot at by everything from rifles to artillery to Luftwaffe fighters. And he'd died because a truck driver made a left turn without looking. The U.S. Army promoted him to General of the Army posthumously. 4 stars, the same rank as Eisenhower and MacArthur and the other theater commanders. Recognition that came too late to matter to Patton, but meant everything to the soldiers who'd served under him. Because they knew what the politicians and the cautious generals had never fully understood. Patton had changed warfare. Not through invention of new weapons or tactics. The Germans had already proven that mechanized warfare could achieve devastating results through speed and aggression. What Patton did was demonstrate that the same principles could work for American forces. That democratic armies with citizen soldiers could move just as fast and hit just as hard as totalitarian war machines built on decades of military tradition. He'd taken the Wehrmacht's own doctrine and used it to destroy them. The numbers told the story. From August 1944 to May 1945, the Third Army advanced further, captured more territory, and destroyed more enemy forces than any comparable American unit. They'd liberated over 12,000 towns and cities across France, Luxembourg, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and Czechoslovakia. They'd captured over 956,000 enemy soldiers. They'd suffered 136,165 casualties while inflicting estimated losses of 1.4 million on German forces. But the real impact couldn't be measured in statistics. Patton had proven that speed was a weapon. That tempo could be more decisive than firepower. That creating chaos in enemy command structures was more valuable than destroying enemy units in pitched battle. Every principle of modern mechanized warfare that would dominate military thinking for the next 70 years had been demonstrated by the Third Army's campaigns. The Israeli Defense Forces studied Patton's tactics when developing their own doctrine of rapid maneuver warfare. The Soviet Union analyzed his campaigns when refining their operational art. The U.S. Army built its airland battle doctrine around concepts that Patton had executed instinctively in 1944, and the German generals never forgot him. Decades after the war, when historians interviewed surviving Wehrmacht officers, Patton's name still carried weight. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, who'd commanded German forces in the West, called him the outstanding Allied tactical genius. General Siegfried Westphal said Patton was the American Guderian. He understood tank warfare better than any of their other commanders. But perhaps the most revealing assessment came from a junior German officer who'd fought against the Third Army in France. Years after the war, he was asked what made Patton different from other American generals. "He fought like he was already dead," the officer said. "Like a man who had no fear because he'd seen his own death 1,000 times in previous lives. We fought many brave commanders, many skilled tacticians, but Patton fought like someone who'd been fighting wars since the dawn of time and knew exactly how each one would end." It was an odd observation, almost mystical, but it captured something essential about Patton that the official histories and tactical analyses always missed. He'd believed in reincarnation, genuinely believed he'd fought in ancient battles, that he'd died on battlefields throughout history and come back to fight again. To anyone else, it sounded like delusion or eccentricity. But for Patton, it meant something profound. It meant he had no fear. Because if death was just a transition to the next life, the next war, the next battlefield, then there was no reason to hold back. No reason to be cautious. No reason to fight carefully or preserve forces or wait for the perfect moment. You attacked. Always. You moved faster than the enemy could think. You created chaos and exploited it and never gave them time to recover. You fought like a man who'd been doing this forever. And that was the secret the German generals had tried to understand. The thing that made Patton different from every other Allied commander they faced. He didn't fight to survive. He fought to win. And he was willing to risk everything, every single day, because he fundamentally didn't believe that death was the end. The Mad Bulldog of the West. The nickname had started as a warning among German commanders trying to predict where he'd strike next. It had spread through Wehrmacht communications as a kind of shorthand for chaos and unpredictability. By the end of the war, it had become something else. Recognition, almost respect, the acknowledgement that they'd faced someone who played the game at a level they understood but couldn't match. 79 years after Patton's death, military academies still teach his campaigns. Tank commanders still study his tactics. Historians still debate whether his methods could work in modern warfare with precision weapons and satellite surveillance and all the technology that's transformed combat since 1945. But they miss the point. Patton's methods weren't about technology. They were about psychology, about understanding that war is fundamentally about breaking the enemy's will faster than they can break yours, about creating momentum that becomes self-sustaining, about moving so fast that you're inside the enemy's decision cycle, forcing them to react to yesterday's situation while you're already creating tomorrow's crisis. The Germans had understood this in 1940 when their panzers carved through France in 6 weeks. They'd built an entire military doctrine around speed and shock and aggressive exploitation of weakness. They'd conquered most of Europe using those principles. Then they met Patton and discovered that someone had learned their lessons better than they had. Someone who didn't just understand mechanized warfare intellectually, but felt it in his bones. Who didn't need staff officers to calculate optimal advance rates because he could sense when units were moving too slowly. Who didn't analyze battles after they ended, but saw them unfolding like chess games 3 moves before anyone else recognized the pattern. The Mad Bulldog, who'd spent his entire life preparing to fight wars across centuries, and who, in the end, had less than 2 years to prove what he could do. 2 years that changed everything. End